Es tut mir leid, dass ich muss auf Englisch reden, aber Deutsch ist wirklich nicht gut genug, einen ganzen Vortrag auf diese Sprache zu geben. I'm sorry, I'm contradicting myself. But that was about the extent of my German, I'm afraid. I will speak slowly, and I will try not to use complicated words. And I think, Jochen, you suggested that if there is a group of some who would like some occasional translation, we could sit in one of these sides, or is it okay? Can you understand me? Yes. Okay. Good. I'll begin. Okay, so let's begin. I'd like to, again, look at some of the key terms that we've been exploring. And let's start with the word secular. Secular comes from the Latin seculum, and it means this age, or this time, more broadly speaking, the world we live in now, the world that we know from our history, the world that we imagine as existing after our deaths, that is our secular world. There's no suggestion here of there being other realms of existence elsewhere. There's no suggestion of our surviving life after death. Again, these things might exist, I don't know. But a secular approach for me to Buddhism is to focus the entirety of one's practice upon the dukkha, the suffering, the crises, the challenges that we as sentient creatures, as rational animals, confront as we live on this planet at this time. So when I use a word like secular Buddhism, I'm thinking of Buddhism as a practice, as an ethic, as a philosophy that seeks to address the conditions under which we currently live on this planet. That to me is secular Dharma or secular Buddhism. I also don't want to think of secular as somehow completely separate or different from any religious concerns. Again, in our usual usage of the word, secular stands for what is not religious. The secular world and the religious world. And broadly speaking, I accept that distinction as a valuable one to make. I'm not interested in religion as an institution with its power structures. I'm not interested in religion as a body of certain doctrines and dogmas that have some transcendent source, be that source God or be it the Buddha's enlightenment, but rather to think of religion as tapping into a very deep human need So putting aside the institutions, putting aside the dogmas, and coming back to the question of why do we have religions in the first place? And my suggestion would be that the world's religions are effectively systems of ideas and stories and narratives that help us come to terms with the deep questions of what it means to be born and what it means to die. I feel that at some level, however secular you are, however committed you are to atheism, you still engage with the fundamental questions of who am I? Why do I die? What is the meaning of life? These, for me, are questions that are not just intellectual. They reverberate through my body, and they lie at the source of my deepest concerns. Again, I would follow Paul Tillich, who defines faith, das Glauben, as the state of being ultimately concerned. And that's not, I think, very different from Socrates, who says that an unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, to be ultimately concerned, to seek to lead an examined life, has for me a certain religious vibration to it. I can't think of a better word. It resonates at a deeper pitch than our everyday chattering mind. So if I speak of secular Buddhism, I'm not suggesting that deep religious core of much of our human experience is somehow negated at all. I'd like to start with a very short Buddhist discourse that we find in the Anguttara Nikaya, I think, and it concerns a dialogue between Gautama, the person we know as the Buddha, and a wandering priest or something, we don't quite know who this guy was, called Sivaka. Now, Sivaka knows nothing about Buddhism, but he has heard that the Buddha teaches a dharma, we'll come to that word later, a dharma that is clearly visible. And he goes to the Buddha and he says, what do you mean? What do you mean your dharma is clearly visible? And Gautama turns the question back onto Sivaka. He says, let me ask you the question, Sivaka. Again, a very Socratic move to turn the question back on the questioner, to get the questioner to come up with the answer himself. So Gautama asks Sivaka, Sivaka, do you know what it's like to be reactive, to be having attachments and desires and fears and hatreds going on in your mind? And Sivaka says, yes, of course. And then Gautama says, and do you know what it's like to be non-reactive, to not be taken over with desires and fears and egoism and so on? And Sivaka says, yeah, sure. And then Gautama says, it's in that sense that the Dharma is clearly visible. Now, we probably have to unpack that a bit. The Dharma, therefore, in this example, doesn't refer to Buddhist teaching. It doesn't even refer to Buddhist practice. Dharma refers to a non-reactive mind. In other words, when we are not in a state in which we're driven by our hatreds, our fears, our lusts, our pride or whatever, then we experience a stopping, a stilling. It might be very momentary, but that non-reactive space, that is the Dharma. That is the Dharma. And not only is that Dharma clearly visible, in other words, even someone like Sivaka, who knows nothing about Buddhism, even someone like Sivaka is aware that there is a dimension of his experience in which he's not overwhelmed, he's not driven by these emotional, reactive habits and patterns. What Gautama seems to be saying, therefore, is that this capacity to be non-reactive is present for all human beings. It's not some special privilege of people who meditate or Buddhists, but it is actually part of our human birthright. The capacity, even momentarily, to be still and clear in our minds. Now, obviously, this is something that can be further developed and deepened and so on, and that is the practice, if you wish, of the Dhamma, but the actual experience is right here and now. Now, there's another dialogue where the similar thing happens, but this time with a Brahmin called Jangusoni, same dialogue, but here instead of saying the Dharma is clearly visible, the Buddha is saying nirvana is clearly visible. And when he defines nirvana in the earliest texts, it's simply the absence of greed, the absence of hatred, the absence of Verblendung, confusion. That's nibbana. It is the non-reactive space that is clearly visible, and the list continues. It's not just clearly visible, but the Dhamma and nirvana, are also immediate. In other words, they're not arrived at by a series of steps in time. They're atemporal in that sense, akaliko. They are inviting. There's something about this non-reactive space that is attractive. It calls to us. There's something deeply reassuring, perhaps, about it, something that opens up new ways of seeing ourselves in the world. It's also uplifting. In other words, there's a certain dignity to this contemplative awareness. And finally, it is personally experienced by the wise, not personally experienced by the Buddhists, but by wise people in all cultures. My own sense, in fact, is that this nibbana, this Dhamma, is very close to the Greek idea of ataraxia, possibly quite close to the Chinese idea of wu wei, non-action, which interestingly was the Chinese term the early Buddhists used to render the word nirvana. So part of my project is very much about going back as far as we can to the time of Gautama himself. We have a much better understanding now of that context, historically, of what it was like, the world in which he lived, and at the same time to try through means of historical critical study, philological study, to try to get as close as we can to what ideas and images and texts would have an earlier rather than a later origin. As Thomas mentioned, we cannot know anything about this period for sure. We'll always be somehow working with probabilities. But I think our scholarship now is at a state where we can have a greater degree of confidence that certain core ideas go back to a period maybe not to that of the Buddha himself, but to close to that, and thereby are able to engage in a process that I would call rethinking the Dharma from the ground up. So my approach to a secular Dharma is to try to recover some of these core ideas and to articulate them, not in the language of classical Indian thought or in Chinese thought, but to articulate them in the kind of idioms and discourses and media that are those of our contemporary world. Now, I'm going to start, therefore, with this idea of a secular Dharma that is founded upon a capacity, we might call it a foundational capacity, to be relatively non-reactive. I don't think non-reactivity is one thing, reactivity is another. They're kind of poles apart, and it's an either-or situation. Life is not like that. We are always probably somewhere on a spectrum between being more or less reactive. We're not aiming here at some sort of perfection, but we're finding, as it were, a way of life in which we can somehow refine our judgments, our perceptions, our ethical concerns according to this way, this middle way that is opening up from a perspective of non-reactivity. It's worth perhaps bearing in mind also that non-reactivity is profoundly linked to the idea of Achtsamkeit, of mindfulness. If you're familiar with the literature, the opening paragraph of the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, begins by saying that sati, mindfulness, is the direct way to nirvana. And I don't think that is religious polemic. I think it's actually a fairly matter-of-fact statement that mindful awareness is what already contains within it the foundational capacity to be non-reactive. Whether you are a monk meditating in a cave in Burma, or whether you are a stressed housewife living in Heidelberg, and you're both practicing mindfulness, you're doing essentially the same thing. You might be doing it for quite different reasons, you might have a very different understanding of it, but basically what you're doing is the same, as Thomas was saying, the same mental act. You are choosing, you are deciding not to react to your thoughts and your emotions, but instead to simply notice them and to see them play themselves out. They rise, they pass away. You don't have to identify with them. You don't have to let yourself be carried away into these endless loops of worry and anxiety and so forth and so on. You can simply see them for what they are. And it's that stillness, that capacity to observe the reactions that rise up within us, that is already a glimpse of nirvana itself. Because to be mindful of reactivity is in itself not reactive. The mindfulness of our, let's say, some rage or some lust that is filling our mind, the mindfulness of it is not full of rage, is not full of lust. It's simply observing what's going on. And this, as Thomas was suggesting, is a capacity that can be developed and further refined in pretty much any human context at all. I would strongly encourage you to see the film that Thomas was talking about, that his wife, Anja Krug-Metzner, produced. I saw it in June in Amsterdam, and it is marvelous. It is really a marvelous piece of filmmaking. And what I was particularly struck by was how the film is paced in such a way that without having to tell you anything, it slowly brings you, maybe through a certain mirroring, into a quiet, mindful space. It doesn't just tell you about these kids in the football team, but it actually shows you, not just through what these people are doing, but the way that the editing and the length of time the camera dwells on the object. It shows you how mindful awareness is embedded in human lives of all different kinds and types and varieties. So this non-reactive awareness, this mindfulness, is also a middle way. These ideas are synonymous. Gautama presents his teaching as a middle way, usually a middle way between self-punishment on the one hand, self-indulgence on the other. But this also gets developed philosophically into a middle way between is and is not, between being and non-being, between the polarities of language itself. And what I think this points to in practice is a constant training of judgment, one that is constantly alert to how we are so prone to swing to some extreme position, some absolutist opinion we have about something, or the validity of some powerful emotion I can't free myself from. So a middle way is not describing some abstract path. It is describing an actual stance and relationship that one cultivates and develops from moment to moment, in which one constantly seeks to maintain this equanimity, this balance, this harmony, this receptivity. It's like a person walking on a tightrope with a long pole. It's this balancing act. That's really how mindfulness is somehow embodied in the ongoing situatedness of our lives in the world. Another characteristic of someone who is practicing mindfulness, cultivating non-reactivity, walking this middle way, is that they become increasingly autonomous. The word the Buddha uses is apara-pachaya, not dependent on others. This is a phrase that occurs again and again in the suttas, in the Pali suttas, but strangely it's not an idea that is widely broadcast through Buddhism. I don't want to get into the reasons for that, but the point is that this was clearly held as a virtue, as something to be aspired to by the early community itself. It's not a reflection of us Westerners wanting to be, really special individuals. It's a value that is deep there in the Buddhist tradition itself. And that, to me, points very strongly to the Dharma being a practice that enables you to lead more fully your own life It's a life that's not being determined by, let's say, social, parental pressures or economic pressures, or maybe ideological or religious beliefs, but it's a practice that increasingly seeks to recover your own authority, your own autonomy. But to do that, the first step is to somehow find a way to become free from the pressures and drives of greed and hatred and delusion. The real autonomy here is not the autonomy from, let's say, some political system, but it's an autonomy from the forces that habitually and intensely at times drive us to think and say and do something that subsequently we regret, or simply that we feel somehow that we're letting ourselves down when we allow those emotions to take over. We're not any longer being the kind of person we aspire to be. So this points, I think, very clearly to mindfulness in the way I've just sketched it as being already an ethical standpoint, an ethical perspective on life. One very good parable that Gautama gives that illustrates this is his image of mindfulness as being like the guardian at the gateway of a city. The purpose of the gatekeeper, let's say, is to admit into the city those who are welcome and to keep out of the city those who are not welcome. So mindfulness, therefore, serves as a kind of an ethical clearinghouse, as it were. It's our capacity as we become more grounded in our own inner stillness and clarity of mind, to be able to notice earlier and earlier in the game when a particular thought or emotion begins to stir within us, to recognize it, and then if it's an emotion or an opinion or a thought that is not welcome, we don't suppress it, we don't deny it, we say, oh, it's you again. And we simply allow it to play itself out. The great beauty, I feel, of these mindfulness approaches is that we're finding, again, a middle way between repression, in other words, stamping down those bits of ourselves that we can't accept or are socially unacceptable or whatever, repression. And on the other hand, the opposite of that, just giving everything free expression. In other words, if I feel angry, I mustn't bottle it up, I must express my anger, I must express this, express that. And we allow these emotions just to leach out into the world of our friends, our societies, our families, our workplaces. So again, here we can see how how mindfulness is, in a sense, the inner agent who pursues this balancing act, this tightrope walk through life, holding a balance and achieving that balance by what it lets in and what it leaves out, what it lets go of, what it lets, as it were, just rise and pass away. And on the other hand, if we find that spontaneously we respond to a situation with love or with generosity or with kindness or with wisdom, then that, of course, is something that we cultivate, we honor, and we welcome. But the decision is made by that inner capacity to be mindfully aware, moment to moment, of what is going on deep within us and what is going on in the world around us. The aim of this practice is not to become the world champion at watching your breath without interruption. The aim of this practice is to achieve a degree of human integration. And so the middle way is synonymous in early Buddhism with the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is really just shorthand for an integrated life in which all aspects of our humanity are brought into a greater alignment. The way we see the world, the way we think about it, the choices we make, the things we say, the things we do, our work, our livelihood, this is emphasized, the way we focus our energies, the way we apply ourselves, and the way we pay attention with mindfulness, and the way we focus our mind with samadhi, or collectedness, concentration. Now, that to me is something that is entirely secular. It's really got nothing to do with any religious beliefs. You don't have to hold on to any Buddhist ideas like rebirth or karma or any of those things. It's a practice that is suited to whoever is drawn to live this way. And to do so, again for different reasons, but in my own case, and I suspect for many of us who have come to this workshop, it has to do with how can I flourish most fully as the human person I am. And that is not just an individualistic thing, because the person I am is not separated and cut off from the world. Who I am is profoundly durchgedringt, how do you say that? Pervaded, saturated with my social environment, with those who have raised me, those who have taught me, those whom I'm responsible for. The entire world is somehow implicit in this distinct being that I am. I've recently been reading an extraordinary novel by Karl Ove Knausgaard. Are you familiar with this? It's just been translated. The last volume has just been translated into English. I don't know what it's called in German, but in English it's called My Struggle, Mein Kampf. He does in fact spend a long section at the end of the book talking about Mein Kampf by Hitler. It's an incredible essay, absolutely amazing essay. But in any case, that's beside the point. What he says in one of his reflections on literature, in describing how James Joyce in particular became the forerunner of the modernist style, was that he ceased to present the protagonist or the hero of the novel as someone detached from the world who kind of looks onto it with a certain perspective, but always stands apart as an autonomous individual. For Knausgaard, what James Joyce did, was understand the person as not a separate conscious entity, but as a unique location where the world happens. So if you read Ulysses, if you read about Leopold Bloom or Stephen Dedalus, these basically are the beings through whom Dublin in 1904 comes to life. And this is exactly what Knausgaard does in describing in extreme detail his ordinary, totally banal existence, going to the supermarket to get food for dinner to feed his 3 kids, 20 pages. But what he does is that he becomes the location for the revelation of the world, not a detached observer standing outside of it. And this, I think, has enormous resonances with the sort of practice we're doing, and I think it's a very good example of a literature that is somehow keeping track with some of these ideas that we're exploring here. Luckily, Knausgaard knows nothing about Buddhism, so he's not trying to sort of smuggle it in. It is just how he has come as a writer to come and to understand and see the world. So, in brief, having now given you a sense of where I'm coming from, of how Dharma, Nirvana, mindfulness, autonomy, middle way, ethical judgment, ongoing, how those are all integral to the practice that we are doing, I would like now to just give you the framework within which that way of life can be conceptualized and understood in a way that could be helpful. I'm sure all of you are aware that Buddhism is founded on a doctrine called that of the Four Noble Truths, die vier edlen Wahrheiten. Again, through research that I've been doing, and also research other scholars have been doing, there is a case to be made, I think quite a good case, to consider the Four Noble Truths as a later addition that wasn't there at the beginnings. We don't know quite what was there, but there is quite a number of indicators to show that the Four Noble Truths came along at a later date. There's also, I think, quite a lot of evidence to show that after Gautama died, then his followers, particularly the monks who formerly were Brahmins, of which there were some important figures, Mahakassapa, Sariputta, Moggallana, and others, is that they sought to bring the Dharma, what Gautama had taught, into greater alignment with the religions that were flourishing in India at that time, particularly Jainism and Hinduism, or Brahmanism, as we should strictly speaking say. And in order to somehow be able to compete within the religious marketplace, as it were, it seems that some figures within the early community began to emphasize these truth claims, these Four Noble Truths, as a way to present the Buddha's teaching as one that would achieve the goals of salvation, which in India was liberation from the cycle of birth and death, which is what the Brahmins, the Jains, were primarily concerned with, and the Buddhist community got drawn into this same soteriology, this same way of thinking about freedom. So the Four Noble Truths present the problem, suffering, the cause of the problem, craving and ignorance, the end of the problem, nirvana, and the Eightfold Path is the way that leads to nirvana and ultimately to liberation from the cycle of birth and death, or, if you're a bodhisattva, the vow to keep coming back until everybody can achieve nirvana. I want to put all of that to one side. I'm not interested in that anymore at all. I'm not interested in the doctrines, and in particular, I'm trying to free myself from the inner logic of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths embody a certain way of thinking that is essentially remedial. You've got a problem, you understand the cause, get rid of the cause, you'll get rid of the problem. That is true. I think mindfulness can be utilized very effectively within that paradigm, but I think it distracts us from what Gautama was laying out, namely a way of life which includes philosophy, contemplation, and ethics, a way of life that can enable individuals and societies to optimize their potential for leading rich and flourishing lives. For eudaimonia, basically, as the Greeks would have called it. So when we rethink the Four Noble Truths as a sequence of tasks, then we come up with a different kind of paradigm, a different logical core of what the Dharma is trying to do. Now, these tasks are quite clearly stated at the conclusion of Gautama's first discourse, or let's say the discourse that is traditionally regarded as his first discourse. He says in the penultimate paragraph of that text that he could not consider himself to be fully awake until he had recognized, performed, and mastered four things. And those four things are comprehending suffering, understanding suffering, embracing suffering is one, letting go of reactivity, letting go of craving, aversion, pride, letting go of that in the way that I explained, not suppressing it or pushing it away, but just seeing it for what it is and not buying into its story. That's the second task, let go of reactivity. The third task is to behold the stopping of reactivity. The word is sachikaroti in Pali. It means to see it with your own eyes. To really see it with your own eyes. And I think what that probably means is not, obviously not literally, but to taste, to feel, to sense in your body what it's like to be non-reactive. In other words, to taste and feel this nibbanic space that is visible, that is palpable when reactivity dies down and maybe momentarily comes to a stop. That is nirvana, that is clearly visible, etc., etc. But that's only the third task. The fourth task is then to cultivate a way of life, to cultivate the Eightfold Path, essentially. And this is obviously a lifelong endeavor, but it's a lifelong endeavor that begins from living from a non-reactive stance. In other words, not conditioned by your greed and your hatred and your fears and your egoism, but to lead a life, an ethical life, that is uninflected by those drives. In other words, a life that is driven more and more by conscious choice and by rational reflection. That is what informs what is called right view, right intention, right speech, right acts. They are right, or samma, integral, integrated, because they are undriven by those reactive patterns that continuously assail us. So the four tasks, or reading the Four Noble Truths as a sequence of tasks, also explains why the Four Noble Truths are presented in that order. Because embracing suffering, in other words, being totally open to the situation you find yourself in at any given moment, embracing it not just conceptually, but also emotionally, empathetically. The practice of this first task is the practice of embracing life in its totality. It's to say, yes, this is the situation I find myself in now. And that's effectively what one does when one sits in meditation. You sit down and you say, yes, this is what is going on. I may not like it particularly, I might be tired, I might be bored, I might be raging with anger, but this is where I start. That's the important point. And as soon as you've done that, you have already adopted a nibbanic perspective, a non-reactive perspective. So what we cultivate in meditation, whether it's as part of embracing life, whether it's part of letting go of reactivity, which is the next step, whether it's part of feeling and sensing and tasting that non-reactive quality, or whether it's about how we then see, think, act, work, and so on. All of this is of a continuum. And this continuum, embracing, letting go, seeing, acting, is not a linear process that goes from A to Z, but it's like a positive feedback loop. A positive feedback loop, a good example of one would be giving birth. When a woman goes into labor, her body releases oxytocin, a hormone, that triggers a contraction, and the contraction triggers oxytocin that triggers the next contraction. And so you have what looks like a cyclical process, but it's in the service of the birth of a child that is occurring in time. And I find that a very beautiful image. It was suggested to me by a midwife who was on one of my courses some years ago. But I think it illustrates this rather well. It's also interesting to see how Gautama too uses the imagery of midwives and mothers, as of course does Socrates. Socrates' whole approach is maieutic. It's about bringing something forth. It's about giving birth to something new. So there's something very dynamic in this process. And as a positive feedback loop, what's more important is the performance of those tasks that enables this process to flow. The path, the Eightfold Path that Gautama speaks of, is very often compared to a stream, flowing water. And the reactivity is compared to a barren place, an arid field where nothing can grow. The metaphorical language that's used here suggests very much that this practice of the Dharma is about allowing us to flow, allowing us to live and flourish. And that's what I feel this four-task model, the middle way, mindfulness, the ethics, it's all integrated into this one process of living more fully. So that's, I think, a good place to stop. Oh, yes, no, I'll do one more thing. Just as a conclusion, this touches on something Sylvia was saying about the bodhisattva. And what has struck me for some time is the connection between the Four Noble Truths, the four tasks in my language, and the four vows of the Bodhisattva we find in Chinese tradition. I'll say what these four vows are. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them all. Delusions are endless. I vow to let them all go. Dharma gates are innumerable. I vow to learn them all. The Buddha way is supreme. I vow to master it. Now, I feel, and others have pointed this out too, that this is just a rephrasing of the four tasks. The four truths don't really fit terribly well with that, but as soon as you think of them as tasks, embrace suffering, let go of reactivity. The third one's more tricky. The third task is to see the stopping of reactivity. And the fourth task is to cultivate the path. So 1, 2, and 4 are almost exactly the same. But number 3, what does that mean? It says in Chinese, Dharma gates are numberless. I vow to learn them all. A Dharma gate, think of a gate. It's a frame, a lintel, and 2 sidebars, and an empty space. A gate is an empty space through which you can go without obstruction or hindrance. That is nirvana. Nirvana is a non-reactive space. Once the chatter of reactivity dies down, you are then offered a gateway through which to then embark on your path. So Dharma gates are numberless means basically situations in life are numberless. I vow to learn them all. In other words, every situation in life offers us the possibility of responding to it in a non-reactive way. So that, again, brings back this bodhisattva ideal, the notion that this practice is not just some selfish trip, but it's actually a practice that we engage in out of concern and love for the world in which we live. Thank you.